are ones that have actually changed us in ways that we believe are for the good and for a deeper and better understanding of the gospel. Brother Joe is not now at Perkins School of Theology. He is in a very exciting work of what we might call lay theology with students. He is I'm not sure the title, but he's the director of what is called a Christian Faith and Life Community. I understand that at Perkins there are some 85 students who are getting a very unique experience. They take classwork at the University of Texas, but in this community they have opportunities for seminars and for worship experience and Bible study, and for relating what they learn in their classrooms to their Christian faith, and many other unique experiences. I see we have some international students here. I understand several live there. We're going to hear Mr. Matthews tonight on the subject, the man of unfaith. You may think that that would be unrelated to all of these strange pictures that we have around here, but he tells me that there is some relationship between our study of Steig, which we have done this year, and his message. Without saying any more, I want to introduce to you the Reverend Joseph Wesley Matthews. Joe?
Senior.
You want this on?
I don't know. You can't hear me, holler. I do not know how you come upon yourself, but I am continually stumbling across me as one who forgets that he lives in an insecure world and that he himself is an insecure man. But occasions like this, I am no longer permitted to forget that I am an insecure man and live in the midst of an insecure existence. If you had a peek into my state of being and could make a phenomenological study of that state, you'd understand what I mean. I feel almost insecure enough at the moment to tell a joke, but not quite. I will, however, read to you a bit of poetry. Oh, you dear idiots of Galatia, who saw Jesus Christ the crucified speaking so plainly, who has been casting a spell over you? I will ask you one simple question. Did you receive the Spirit of God by trying to keep the law or by hearing the gospel? Surely you can't be so idiotic as to think that a man begins his spiritual life in the Spirit and then completes it by reverting to external observances. I simply cannot believe it of you. Does God, who gives you His Spirit and works miracles within you, do these things because you have obeyed the structures of culture or because you have believed the gospel? Ask yourselves that. At one time, when you had no knowledge of God, you were under the authority of the gods, who have no real existence. But now that you have come to know God, or rather are known by Him, how can you revert to dead and sterile principles and consent to be under their power all over again? Your religion is beginning to be a matter of external observances. Frankly, you stagger me. You make me wonder if all of my efforts over you have been entirely wasted. It is to freedom that you have been called, my brethren. Plant your feet firmly, therefore, within the freedom that Christ has won for us, and do not let yourselves be caught again in the shackles of slavery. Huh? Not bad. I want to read to you part of the introduction by Wolcott Gibbs to The Lonely Ones, which you have read. For a good many years, William Steig has been drawing rational, though occasionally disconcerting, pictures for various publications. It is hard to define the spatial quality of these works, since so many warring elements seem to have gone into them: cruelty and compassion, burlesque and acute social perception, a limited domestic environment. All of Steig's characters appear to live in the same room, and it is meagerly furnished, and a highly complicated, or at least an intensely emotional, atmosphere. Steig has been a successful humorist artist for a long time, but apparently for him that hasn't been enough. Something in his searching and fiercely unorthodox nature has driven him beyond picturing the activities of the flesh and into a pure investigation of the Spirit. Let me read that over to you again. Something in his searching and fiercely unorthodox nature has driven him beyond picturing the activities of the flesh and into a pure investigation of the Spirit. In The Lonely Ones, Mr. Steig offers us a series of impressions of people who have been set off from the rest of the world by certain private obsessions. They are not necessarily unhappy. Let me read this again. They are not necessarily unhappy. Some of them, in fact, are obviously only too well pleased with themselves, and loneliness or singularity is, of course, by no means an unhappy state. They are simply not quite like other girls and boys, although for the life of me it's hard for me to find those other girls and boys. In the best of his pictures, there is a queer, distorted, but absolutely faithful definition of character available to most of us only in alcohol or a dream, when an old friend is apt to appear fantastic but recognizable as the essence of what he is rather than what he looks like. It is Mr. Steig's good fortune, although sometimes it must make him a little nervous, to possess this extra vision while wide awake and, as far as I know, cold sober. This book is obviously not for everybody. A good many people will find it obscure and, consequently, exasperating. Others will find it simply another manifestation of an age that produces Gertie Stein and Picasso and a form of musical expression called boogie-woogie or the rite of spring. Still others will be offended by a talent that can turn out a drawing of a mad woman with an umbrella and caption it, "Mother loved me, but she died." These, for my dough, are almost exclusively the mirror gazers with whom Mr. Steig is concerned as a psychiatrist. And the rest of you, I think, should have a very good time. I want to talk to you about Mr. Steig in a very indirect way tonight, for Mr. Steig is a prophet in our time who has been able to see that man. What do I mean, man? I never met man. What I meant to say, and just now I'm getting courage enough to say, he saw clearly into the sickness that's in you. This is harder to say, and in me, but nonetheless true. But nonetheless true. And yet, it seems to me that the man who wrote this preface is precisely correct when he suggests that the perspective from which Steig viewed the illness of man in our time was the perspective of spirit. That it was through the category of spirit that he interpreted the illness in the 20th century, the illness in you and the illness in me. But before I talk about the categories of the Spirit through which we can hear what Mr. Steig is saying to us, I must begin at the beginning, where we are. And where we are, it seems to me, is in the 6th decade of the 20th century on the college campuses in the United States of America. And what I see on the college campuses is a horrifying sight to behold. There's a devil-may-care, a what-the-hell attitude. There's a lackadaisical, there's an apathetic spirit. There is a sense of just being a cabbage, and not only being a cabbage, but being content to be a cabbage. Up at the University of Texas, they've got a kept paper, and have had a kept paper for 1 year, and there's scarcely a voice raised against it. And when the editor, in defense of whisperings that the paper kept, he wrote an article saying, nobody has really screened what we have to say in the paper. The censors just let go through what goes through. And one genius on the campus, a prophet of Yahweh from where I stand, he made this little quip. There's no use turning off the spigot when the pipes are not connected. Well, laugh about that when you go home. But be careful, there's a hook in it. Wherever I go to talk with people, I find that they sense the same type of vacantness. And this is something new. I'm not talking about what's been here since the time Eliot took up his pen and wrote The Hollow Man. In this 6th decade, something else is here. Something else is here. As a matter of fact, I think this decade is very comparable to the 1st decade on college campuses in this century, but for precisely the opposite reason. In the 1st decade, the college campus student, he had the world by the tail. Well, he didn't exactly have it by the tail, but his mama and papa had it by the tail, and his professors had it by the tail, and all he had to do was to wait a few more years, and they'd have this universe wrapped up in a nice package, and there would just be joy and happiness everywhere. And with this was an apathetic spirit. And then you move to the 2nd decades, the decades of the teens. I call this the traumatic decades in which Western civilization received a shock that we're still reeling from yet. And oh, what a traumatic experience that must... Hey, I was living then. I keep forgetting that, too. That must have been at least to my elders in the days, for I suggest to you that you should always remember and let this burn down deep into your being that William Jennings Bryan, the Secretary of State, just a few months before the outbreak of World War II, prophesied that the millennium was just around the corner. And then came the end of the liberal experiment with the explosion of the First Worldwide War. And then followed closely on the heels of that, was the October Revolution in 1917, which has got us frightened like pigs, in a thunderstorm even to this day. As a matter of fact, not much went on in college campuses in the teens because many of the people were away trying to get their feet under them as a result of the blow that our century had received. And the ones that were there, were not thinking about anything very much, but perhaps laying the groundwork for the giddy 20s. That was a wonderful time to be on a college campus. That was the era of the short-skirted flapper, the bearskin coats or coonskin coats, and the little bamboo canes with a pennant on the end that you waved at football games, in which we were doing our damnedest to try to pretend that what happened in the teens didn't happen at all, or if it really did happen, sooner or later that we would get back to what was there in the 1st decade. As a matter of fact, this not only had its secular manifestations of escape, it also had its religious. I was reading a book just not long ago about an ecumenical conference that took place in this country in which the students of all the universities got together. And the speeches in this time were really great evangelistic speeches. They really had something cooking religiously on the campuses in the 20s, or they were great crusades for peace and so forth, and making just as much noise as was really out to the football games, and I think precisely for the same reason, to try to pretend to ourselves that what happened in the teens did not really happen. And then came those sobering, very, very sobering 30s, after the first worldwide depression, in which the balloon of the 20s had been burst. This was a wonderful time to be on a... I was a student then on college campuses. This was a wonderful time to be a student on a college campus. For at least we had been jolted to awareness that what had happened back there had happened, and we could no longer pretend to ourselves that one day we'd look up and it'd go away. And then we dug in to try to patch up what had happened. And this was the time of great liberal hopes and liberal enthusiasms and liberal ideas on the college campus. As a matter of fact, this was the time in which socialism was ripe and rampant. The student on the college campus looks over the horizon for something to patch up his world with, for something to dream about, for something to hope in, and there was nothing there. The churches horribly failed, it seems to me, to provide this kind of a hope. The only thing on the horizon was communism. And I suggest to you, any red-blooded person who was on college campuses in the 30s, who wasn't a communist, or was not making use of Marxism in order to understand who he was and who his world was, and to try to patch up what had happened to our world, was dead. As a matter of fact, in my opinion, the greatest blot on the escutcheon of our country is that here in the 40s, we turn on these vital, red-blooded young fellows in the 30s who were agonizingly reaching out for anything that would give a bit of the hope in the world, and we saw them as traitors, as men who committed treason again. That's nonsense. But then we moved into the 40s, and each one of these has sort of a shock ahead of it, doesn't it? And World War II. And after World War II on the college campuses, it was a great time. As a matter of fact, I was teaching in an undergraduate school at that time, and I suggest to you there was no greater time to be a teacher from one point of view on a college campus in the history of the United States of America than in those post-war years in the 40s. I tell you, that was a tremendous experience. These young people had come from the shock of the Second World War, and they saw, by golly, there was no patching up in our world, that some way or another we had to get to the bottom of things. Up at Yale University, before the war, there were 70 students in a course of ethics. After the war, there were 700. My guess is now it's back to about 70. Yes? But there were 700 students had come back here, and they were going to get to the bottom of what goes on here. And they got to the bottom, and when they got to the bottom, there wasn't any bottom. And when they got to the bottom, I say there was no bottom. And that ushered in the 50s. That ushered in the 50s. And Colin Wilson wrote the book, The Outsider. If you haven't read that book, by golly, you better get a hold of that before another sun sets and read it. For it's the story of your interior existence. And don't you pay any attention to these two-bit characters who have solidified in their 40s or 50s or 60s who say, "Tish, tish, this isn't the way the world ought to be." Well, by golly, you and I aren't interested, first of all, in what the way the world ought to be. We're interested in the way the world is. And we aren't even interested, first of all, in what you and I ought to be. We're interested in who we are. And Colin Wilson in The Outsider, he tells the story of your life as a college student, in the 6th decade of the 20th century. And the fellow who is an outsider is the man who has hit bottom and has seen there is no bottom. He's tried to latch hold upon this in his culture and that in his culture and that in his culture as one collapses beneath the other until finally there is no permanent ground upon which he can stand, and he understands himself as outside the culture, outside the circle of meaning, outside the structures of significance that are offered to man. This is the outsider. And then, by golly, what's he to do? Well, one of the things that he can do, when he has seen that there is no bottom, is to just try to sort of tiptoe, stumble to his grave, hoping against hope that he can make it more or less respectfully to his grave. But another thing that's a possibility, and this is why I am filled with hope in the midst of this frightful decade of cabbages, is that when you and I come to the place where we see there is no bottom to the bottom, we have presented to us anew the opportunity of hearing the word of the Christian community, namely that the one who meets us where the bottom has no bottom is God. And when one understands this, he understands the category of the Spirit. And this is what I want to talk about tonight in reverse. Steig is talking about the dimension of the Spirit. This becomes a meaningful category when a person sees that there's a final question mark out over all human existence. When a person understands that at the bottom of all human existence there's an enigma, this means you can't answer it. If you think you can answer it, if it's just a problem that one of these days somebody's going to come up with the answer with, you haven't hit the bottom yet. That at the bottom where there is no bottom, there you're encountered with the mystery, out of which you came without a passport, and into which one of these days you go without any license. No, when you meet this last reality, I deem it the last. When you meet this last reality, the relationship you have to this last reality is the category of the Spirit. And when one sees this, he sees that all along he's been related to this last reality. It's been there, though he may not ever have understood it. Therefore, man is who he is finally in relationship to this enigma, this question mark, this which is there beyond all things that he can lay a hold upon, to which he can relate himself and get his bearings and find out who he is. This is always there, and this is what you mean by Spirit. This is what the New Testament meant. It did not mean some giddy little old ghost down inside of you that flitters up to heaven when your body collapses. It meant this relationship with this out of, this into, this edge of all existence. Now, Steig is talking about that relationship in reverse. For if that relationship is there, it's always in us. And if we do not assume responsibility for this relationship and genuinely become men of spirit who stand before this enigma, then we are spiritual men in the negative. And we live our life trying to hide from this fundamental relationship that is within man. This is to say, in our time, that we are recovering anew this fundamental relationship in man. We are discovering anew the fact that all men live before this last enigmatic power, whether they recognize it or not. And to live before this power self-consciously, to live before this last power intentionally, to live before this last power decisively, is to be spirit. But I say you can live before this power in a negative way, and to live before this last power unconsciously, undecisively, negatively, is to be unspirit, or to have lack of spirit. to relate yourself to any other being in a final sense is to be unspirit, because this being to which you relate yourself is also standing before this great enigma, and as it came to be, it'll come not to be. Steig here deals with the category of unspirit, in which men attempt to hide from life as it is, which men attempt to hide from existence as we find it, which is to say, men attempt to hide from the bottomless bottom. And this is unspirit, and this is what you mean sickness by sickness of the spirit. This is the illness. Oh, it has so many forms. The way it happens in you is never the way it happens in me, and the way it happens in you is not the way it happens in us. It is there in all its uniqueness. I'm suspicious of you people who pick out your favorite ones. Very suspicious. On account of you and I are not about to disclose to people around us like this deep inner sickness of the spirit. What the cartoons are saying is that a man will go through hell before he'll even admit to himself that he is unspirit or that he's sick in the core of his being. Yes. You and I talk about, to use the categories of the medieval ages, which aren't very meaningful to us except symbolically. You and I literally would go to hell before we'd face what this man's making us face. Now, I want to talk a little bit psychophysiologically, theopsychologically, about the various categories of unspirit. And I'm going to use a friend of mine, Soren Kierkegaard, to do it. One reason why I'm going to use Kierkegaard is because when I finish, you can go over to your bookstore and buy in this paperback edition of the Anchor series this book, Sickness Unto Death, and deal with it yourself, for I'll have to work with it very loosely. Soren Kierkegaard sees this fundamental sickness, which is a negative relation to this last final reality out there. He sees this in three different ways. First of all, the sickness of the immediate man. And secondly, the sickness of the introverted man. And thirdly, the sickness of the defiant man. The category that Soren Kierkegaard uses to point to this sickness is despair. Now, by despair, this is a highly technical term. He does not mean despondency. For Kierkegaard sees as the man who wrote the introduction to this book that to be in despair or to be sick in the spirit is not synonymous with being unhappy or being despondent. As a matter of fact, it might be quite the other way around. So Kierkegaard talks about the despair of immediacy and the despair of introversion and the despair of defiance. And I suggest to you in these categories you can place all of these pictures in one way or another. First of all, the despair of immediacy. The immediate man for Kierkegaard is the man who lives entirely in terms of relations, entirely in terms of a relationship to external things or events in the area of time, in the area of history. And his relationship to these things are in terms of happiness, unhappiness, pleasure, pain, satisfaction, dissatisfaction. Whenever you hear people talk about themselves in terms of pleasure, pain, or satisfaction or dissatisfaction, you can pretty well guess that they're this immediate man. They live their life in terms of these categories. And it's always in relation to an external event. This gives me happiness or it gives me unhappiness. This gives me pleasure or it gives me pain. And they're all... This is really the hedonistic man, if you like, but they're all forms of this. To be sure, there are some people who probably center upon the fleshly pleasures or those of sex. I suppose they always form some kind of a hierarchy here, but you don't have to stop with this person. On this level, I have a friend of mine who likes music a great deal, and his whole life is in terms of the sensuous aesthetic experience of the pleasure that he gets from music. Or I have a friend who is a philosopher who deals with ideas and their relationships to one another in terms of the satisfaction that he gets out of it. There are people I know who go to church every Sunday in terms of the, what do they call it these days? The peace of mind that they get out of it. This is your immediate man. This immediate man does not know about this category of the Spirit at all, or if he does, it's just as a pinch of salt that has no vital role in his style of life whatsoever. He's a man who is in despair, but does not know that he is in despair because he knows nothing of the dimension of spirit in life, which can turn around and become unspirit. This man lives in terms of the satisfactions of the moment and has never been pressed to this point where he finds this great enigmatic power and hence realizes all along that he was related to it. This is the fellow who goes along happily depending upon the external circumstances, and then lo, one day something will happen. He's had himself a dolly and somebody takes his dolly away. And then he feels great pain. And if you go and ask him, he'll say that he's in despair. But what he means by despair, is unhappiness. He does not mean that he's a disrelated person whatsoever. As a matter of fact, he'll be standing with the piano back of him and saying, "There is the piano." Well, he's right, there is the piano, but it's behind him. I mean by that, he'll say, "I am in despair," and he'll be thinking about his being unhappy. Well, as a matter of fact, he's in despair, but the despair is behind him, and he's not aware of it whatsoever, for by virtue of the fact that he lives in terms of the categories of happiness, unhappiness, means that he's a dispirit, an unspirit. He's a spiritless man. This relationship is there, but he does not know of it, let alone assume responsibility for being this kind of a man in existence. As a matter of fact, when this external event takes place and he feels crushed, he'll lay down like a possum, playing dead before this event, hoping that if he plays dead long enough here, that this nasty thing out here that happened will go away, and things will come back to normal, and he will be a man who has his gizzard tickled. I suppose he's sort of like a possum who every once in a while peeks out with one eye to see whether this nasty thing in life has gone away, and when it does, then he rises up and becomes an alive possum, but still a possum, once again. This fella, if he lives within the Christian community, he's a good churchgoer. He's one of those old women of both sexes that sit down very frequently on the front pew and lap in every word the minister says, especially that minister who lives in the categories of happiness and unhappiness and knows nothing about the dimension of the Spirit, who promises this old lady that life finally is a happy thing, and that the painful things are finally unreal, and if these unreal things happen in this life, after death there'll be a peace for eternity. Oh, this is a nice woman to preach to. By golly, when I had a pulpit, I loved these old ladies, because when I would drool over that pulpit, about the satisfactions in life, I could see that blissful smile upon her face, And as a matter of fact, these always paid you $10 at the funeral because they were so grateful to be promoted by the parson to eternal bliss. Oh, wait. There's another guy here. There's this immediate man who has had this experience of pain, have had people pull away one dolly after another from him until he begins to sense that maybe human existence isn't exactly a matter of pleasure and pain. And this is the first step in reflection upon the category of spirit. And it makes him uneasy. And he'll play possum too. But he's not so sure anything's going to happen. That'll set things back on the normal channel once again. And so what this man does, he's not simply a dead possum here. He gets strength enough to get up, and he goes around wishing he were somebody else. If only I had been George, and hadn't had my father, golly, things would have been happy. Or if only I had had $1 million. choked up. If only I'd been a little brighter, all of this wouldn't have happened out here. And this man then begins to lose himself in the activities of the world. Because if I keep active, this little bit of knowledge that I have that within me is a relationship that is not synonymous with the pleasure-plane categories, if I just keep active, I can keep this way in the back of my being here, behind a closed door, and finally, if I keep active enough, I can forget it almost entirely and stumble to my grave, not having really a happy life, but being like the people around me and having been able to shove down into the unconscious most of the unpleasurable experiences of life. I have pointed out to you the naive man. This is the category that little children live in. And at adolescence, when these kind of wombs maybe should be broken, for many people they do not get broken, so that I meet this naive man, this innocent man, this immediate man, going around with canes, 60, 70 years old. And some of them, will remember that at one time, they were worried a little bit about life when people snatched their dollies away, but they'll say, that was because I was young. And all young people have these upsetting experiences. When they grow old, they see that life is good. And so they live a lie, which they have been able to forget. Almost was a lie. But the man who, when the dollies are snatched, is not able to come back to some kind of a relatively normal life in terms of the categories of satisfaction or dissatisfaction, becomes the introverted man. And this is the man who has come to some real awareness that the final up againstness in life is this enigmatic power, is this great question mark. He has become aware now that there's a relationship to life that is not that relationship which is based upon the pleasure and pain relative to the external events in life. He's begun to smell the fumes of the fact that man fundamentally is a question mark unto himself. But this is the introverted man who now begins to understand what this despair is, but he does not despair as this first one over unhappy experiences. He despairs now over the fact that although he knows that he is a spirit related to this last reality, yet he keeps on living in the categories of pleasure and pain. So now he despairs over the fact that he's the kind of a guy who despairs in terms of pain and dissatisfactions. Do you see that? This is a subtle term, but you've got to follow it, because my guess is that although most people in the world belong in this first category, that perhaps most of you belong in this category right now, that I'm talking about. And this is the man, that though he knows he's a spirit, is still not living over it. And what he has to do is with sheer force try to keep down this awareness that's in him. This is his introversion. And this man can never forget this like the other man might have. It's there in his consciousness. So he lives his life negatively. He lives his life in such a way that he is constantly trying to keep this awareness that he's a phony out of his consciousness. This man is a role player. He plays a role. And so he lives the respectable life. He lives the respectable life. I tell you, you girls who are looking for that, as they say, the happy marriage, the guy I'm describing now is just the husband for you. You find one who is despairing in terms of introversion, he's your boy. Because this man is the gentlest of husbands. He wouldn't think of slapping his wife. Oh, no. He's the gentlest. And, oh, if you want that kind of a family in which the father really loves the children and is tender, you get this man. You get this man because he has to play such a role that no jagged ends in life would stick out to remind him of what he is locked down here in the secret chambers of his being. And I recommend him to you because this man will likely be a success. He would be honest. You could trust him with $1 billion. He'll be respectable. He'll likely be an outstanding citizen, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, or the man who's the chairman of the Red Cross Drive. He'd likely be this. He will avoid, at all cost, any discussions that have to do with this depth of existence. If he hears one, he'll pretend he doesn't know what they're talking about. And he'll persuade himself, almost, that he doesn't know what it is. As a matter of fact, he can become irate that anyone touches this aspect of life. For if this gets out, he's a destroyed man, and he knows it. Does this man go to church? Well, he always wants his wife to go to church. And he'll even drive her to the door and take the children to Sunday school. You can see why. And every Easter, he'll be there himself. Now, this fellow is not naive about the parson. He doesn't go to church. And he'll tell you this because the parson doesn't know what he's talking about. He'll tell you this. For he'll see that the parson is describing his life in terms of this naive way of existing back here. And this man has scorn for the naive man that doesn't know there is such a thing as this dimension of spirit. And he's got most preachers spotted and spotted well. He says they're talking gobbledygook, and he's right, and he knows it. Although there will be, maybe in his community, one minister who really knows what the score is. And this man, is admired by this fellow. And he'll even go and talk with him once in a while. Maybe raise some distant question about the immortality of the soul. But he'll not let this man get too close to him. Always at a distance. And if the conversation takes a serious turn, this man has an important engagement. For he knows that this fellow can get his gizzard. And he respects him for it, but he fears him just as well. But there's one other characteristic of this man. He's got to have some solitude. And so once a year, perhaps, he goes off on a retreat, a Wesley Foundation retreat. Or he just goes and walks out along the lake by himself. For once a year or every few months, he's got to take this secret that he has down inside, alone, and peek at it. He can't live with himself. This would blow him sky high if he doesn't. Then he tucks this in, and he's refreshed. And he comes home more gentle than he ever was before to his wife. Kinder to his children. As a matter of fact, wifey, I think we ought to take out an insurance policy for our children's education. Well, I'll have to hurry on here. Now, sometimes a man can no longer contain this secret behind the locked door, and it bursts out on him. And when this happens to this man, then he plunges into life. He doesn't just go out into the activities of the world. He, with a passion, plunges into life. This is the fanatic man who works around the clock in his business office. This is the man who fanatically moves out into noble and great works. He is not just trying to forget. He is demonically trying to save himself. And as a matter of fact, I speak of great works here because the nobler the works are, the greater a chance you have in the culture of containing this thing that is now loose. Or, if this doesn't work, he throws himself into the life of sensuality and loses himself, or tries to in drink, in dope, in sex. This man is, well, that's enough. My time is up, so I've got to hurry here. Lastly is the defiant man. And this is the man who knows clearly there isn't the slightest haze in front of him that our relationship finally is to the enigmatic power out of which we have come and into which we have gone. He sees this. He sees it more clearly than any saint. And he is awed and frightened by it all. But instead now of running, and as a matter of fact, he's trapped and he cannot run, He's got to stand and face it. And he chooses to stand and face it by defying it. And by defying it, I mean that he chooses to try to make himself and to preserve himself and create himself in spite of this last reality. These are the men like Jean-Paul Sartre, who sees clearly, very clearly, that there's nothingness at the edge of human existence. And then Sartre tries to throw back his shoulders and say, but I'll choose and create myself, and hence overcome this. Well, I suggest this to you. He didn't make a good job of it. He turns into a measly little old humanist, doesn't he? Or these are the Napoleons in history, and I tell you, these men are rare. If you think you're in this category, you're boasting. And these are the men that have our admiration. These are the big shots. These are the men that have great self-control. These are the ones that have tremendous firmness of character, aren't they? I think of the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. And the Grand Inquisitor, he sees clearly that this nothingness, that this freedom, that this horrible responsibility of standing before the great question mark of life is finally the burden, the weight of all men. But he says men can't stand it. So he's going out to make another world. He's going to take men's freedom upon himself and make men happy and help them to forget that this is the way life is and help them to become and remain simply immediate men. He's going to make this world. And what a drive. And anybody who's read this, you stand in awe and admiration of this man. There's an odd thing about these men. The point of it is the drive. They can become Jesus Christ, or they can become Machiavelli. It doesn't make any difference. As a matter of fact, these guys within their thrust have great integrity. But the trouble is, one morning they may thrust this way, and the next morning they may thrust another, and this doesn't make any difference to them, because what they're out to do is to maintain themselves against this great question mark of human existence. And then the final category is the category of the passive defier. He's the man who sees clearly what is at the bottom of human existence and chooses to live his life in defiance of it. And yet he stumbled over something, and he sees he can't make it. And so he latches on this defect and holds this before the world and said, I would have defied, except I got this defect. I didn't have as many brains as my brother had. Or my little boy died when he was young. I know people like this. And these people finally become demonic in their latching on to these things which serve as an excuse or as a crutch, and you try to take it away from them and they'll slit you asunder. I've known a woman who was living on the crutch of the fact her boy died when he was 6 years old, and every day for 20 years she'd been out to the graveside. And I know that if I'd come to this woman and said, I'm able to raise your boy from the dead, that she would have shot me on the spot. The last thing in the world she wanted back was her boy, for now she had used this great sorrow as a crutch to excuse her from the fact that she chose to defy this last one. Well, I've got to quit. These, it seems to me, are the categories of the illness of the spirit that Steig so clearly sees. The illness of the immediate man, the illness of the introverted man, and the illness of the defiant man before this last reality. Now just this word, for I'm not to talk on the man of faith. This is the man of unfaith in a negative relationship to the one who in the Christian community we call God. Just this one word. The Christian community is a community with a word, and without this word it is not who it is. Without this word it has no reason whatsoever for existing. And the word that she has is relevant just at one point in life and no other point. And that point at which this word is relevant is out at the very extremity of human existence, where man encounters this last enigma in life, this last question mark. Sometimes in your Sunday school sometimes your Sunday school teacher taught you that Christianity had to do with grinning and patting little children on the head, and being honest. This is not the Christian word. It has no relevance here in the first instance. It has relevance only out at the very boundary of existence where you meet this last reality out of which you came and into which you're going to go. And secondly, right at this point, the word of the Christian community is the only relevant word there is. Let me repeat this, for I wish to be horribly dogmatic here. At this point, the only relevant word is the word of the Christian community. Now, what is this word? This word is going to come as horrifying to those of you who are in the area of the immediate man, in which happiness, unhappiness is the style of your existence. But it's going to come as such good news to those of you who were pushed out into the midst of this sickness, so you're aware of it. It's going to come as such good news that it's going to be an offense to you, because it's unbelievable. The word that this community pronounces right out there, and which is the only relevant word, is that this last reality is God, and at this point you're accepted, that this one cares for you. I say this is the only relevant word. But when you stand out here, there is no relevant word except that word that gives you possibility for that which has become death for you. And this word is the possibility of life. And the Christian community bears witness. When they have heard this word and taken it unto themselves and dared to live out here before this last one is their God, that lo, they lived. What they were saying, that precisely when you die to all of the wombs in which you hide, when you die to them all, which is to stand before this last one, is to live. And my friend St. Paul put it, lo, when I died to the world, and the world was dead unto me, lo, all became a new creation. I'm through. This bit of advice. What I have said to you tonight, you can understand. For I have not been talking about ideas, but life as it comes to you. You may not choose to understand it, but you can understand it if you choose. But if you choose, watch out. It'll turn you upside down.